Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I appreciate you being with me this Friday morning here on Now TV. And let me say again how much I genuinely appreciate you joining me here on Friday morning, or whatever day you happen to go back and look at the archives and look at the program. As I have mentioned, I am hearing from an increasing number of viewers who are tuning in, who send me private messages, some of which, by the way, disagree, and that's okay. All right? As long as there is respect, as long as there's cordiality. We're living in some very difficult times. We're living in times in which it seems people are becoming more and more entrenched in their views. Doesn't matter if that's political or religious. And instead of being open-minded, instead of having the Berean spirit to examine the scriptures daily to see if what is being said is actually true, and being willing to change our views if we discover that we are wrong, when someone is challenged, what do? They get hostile. They get ugly. They start calling the people who are challenging their views, calling their views into question. They start calling them some of the most ungodly names, acting as if that person has no value, acting as if they were the worst person on the face of the earth. Folks, that's not how we're supposed to do things as Christians. Paul said in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, 24 and following, the child of God must not strive. Now, and that word strive there is a really powerful word. And it means to get into a word war. Now look, Paul was constantly engaged in controversy. He went into the synagogues every Sabbath, and there he reasoned together with the Jews who were willing to listen that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah of God, Acts chapter 17. But there comes a time in which people's attitudes turns a discussion into nothing more than an argument. Now, there's nothing wrong with arguing if the goal and if the aim is truth. If the goal of argument is simply to beat somebody over the head, and to win an argument, and it's not about truth, it's not about what is right, and it's not about becoming closer to God. But it's simply an antagonistic, malicious even, attack on another person, then we have crossed the line. And so Paul says, the child of God must not strive, but be gentle toward all men. And so Paul's attitude toward controversy was respect. It was cordiality. Now, that doesn't mean that our discussions can it sometimes be, how should I express this, spirited, lively. That's fine. But we can have spirited, lively conversations with one another and still appreciate one another as a fellow believer, still respect one another as a fellow believer, and having the attitude of a friend of mine some years ago. He's passed away now. His name is John Anderson. We were great, great friends. And before I knew John an awful long time, we were just discussing different things. And one day he made a comment, but that boy, it just hit me wrong. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? And he said, pay attention to what I'm going to say. I'm going to say it again. I want you to think about it without reacting. He said, unless we are willing to be wrong, we will never be right. Then it hit me, what he was saying. Unless we have an attitude in which we are willing to be corrected, unless we have an humble heart, an open mind, we have a heart and mind like the Bereans of Acts chapter 17, 11 and following, who searched the scriptures daily to see if the things that Paul was saying were true. And remember, this is Paul in the synagogue reasoning with the Jews, and you know what? Their discussions could get really lively. So here is this context of Paul in the synagogue every Sabbath reasoning with the Jews that Jesus is Messiah, and he complimented the Bereans as being more noble than the Thessalonians because the Bereans were willing to open their mind. They were willing to look at the arguments that Paul was offering. So what I have been challenging you to do for the last 2 years plus is to look at the challenge of Christ, where Jesus said, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. And I understand and I appreciate so very, very much, believe me I do, how challenging the challenge of Christ truly is. I was raised in a futurist eschatological environment. I was raised believing that the day of the Lord is an earth-burning, time-ending event in which every dead person, every person who had ever died, decomposed, gone back to the dust, was going to be reconstituted, revived, raised from the dead, and the earth and the elements therein that would be burned up. That was my upbringing, ladies and gentlemen. But as I began to read the scriptures for myself, and as I began to realize what the challenge of Christ is, I realized I had an incredible problem. And the legacy that my father left me was this, okay? And we'll get into our lesson here momentarily. My father was a minister. His father before him was a minister. My grandfather used to ride mules to the country churches and preach. Kind of cool. But anyway, my father used to tell me, Don, listen, it does not matter what I say. It doesn't matter what Grandpa has said. It doesn't matter what any commentary has to say. Doesn't matter what any college professor has to say. He said, now, first of all, you respect what they have to say because they've spent years of study, just like I have, he said, trying to determine the truth. But, he said, if at any time you discover that what I have said is not the truth, he said, well, first of all, let's talk about it. Well, you know what? At one time, on one occasion, I thought I had proven my dad wrong. Thought I had it down pat. I went to him. We set up to way in the morning. And he convinced me I was wrong. Okay? But we both had open minds. And so the legacy that he left me was, once again, doesn't matter what I say, what Grandpa says, what the commentator says, doesn't matter what a university or a professor says. If it's not in the Bible, you take your stand on what the Bible says. Now, he said, if at any point you discover that what you thought was true is not true, then you change it. You do not have such pride that forces you to say, well, you know, this is not what my dad or granddad taught, or this is not what the seminary taught me. I'm not changing my mind. I had one individual tell me on one occasion, listen, ladies and gentlemen, I mean no disrespect whatsoever as I share this anecdote. We were studying eschatology. This gentleman had come out of the Baptist church into the churches of Christ. He came to my office one day and we studied. He thought he had entrapped me on eschatology. I showed him what I considered to be the error of his way, and he just slammed the Bible down on my desk, and he said, Don, I'll tell you right now, I learned at one time that I was wrong as a Baptist, and I changed, and he said, that was shattering, that was challenging. And he said, I'm not going to admit a second time that I'm wrong. And I was like, brother, to admit that we're wrong is to come closer to knowing more of truth. So while I understand, I appreciate the fact that as you sit and listen to me, the chances are about 99.9%, okay, that you were not raised believing. Your church does not believe. Your professors in seminary, perhaps, do not teach that Christ came in AD 70, that was the end of the age. I understand how challenging that is. So when we talk about, on this program, the challenge of Christ is not only to realize, number one, Jesus said he was coming back in the first century. The end of the age was to arrive with the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. That's not the only challenge of Christ. The challenge of Christ is also, I was raised believing that the end of the age is the end of the Christian age. I was raised believing that the coming of the Lord is the end of time. I was raised believing that the resurrection is the raising of human corpses out of the dirt. That's the way I was raised. But boy, as I continued to study the Scriptures, I realized that's not actually what the Bible says. So your challenge, just as it has been, continues to be on a daily basis with me. The challenge of Christ is, are you willing to be wrong in order to be right? You see, we have to be willing to accept the fact that we could be wrong. Instead of bowing up, I was wrong once, I'm not going to admit to being wrong a second time. Just not going to do it. No. That's not the proper Christian attitude. Now, I've spent a good bit of time on that this morning because, again, I understand that as we discuss the challenge of Christ, and as I have shared with you the fact that dispensationalism says God in his omniscience looked down the stream of time, and God chose the first century to send his Son to establish the kingdom in fulfillment of Daniel chapter 9. Okay? All dispensationalists agree with that, ladies and gentlemen. They really do. But dispensationalism tells us when Jesus offered the kingdom to Israel, Israel rejected it in unbelief. Therefore, God withdrew the kingdom offer and established an interim age known as the age of the Gentiles. And it is not until the age of the Gentiles, otherwise known as the church age. It is not until the end of the church age that God raptures the church off of the earth and begins to deal once again with Israel. Over the last several weeks, I've been engaged with the gentleman on YouTube in which he says it was the Jewish unbelief that led to the rejection of the kingdom and the establishment of an interim age, as he likes to call it. The age of the calling of the Gentiles. And I've pointed out to him repeatedly, if we say that God gave the prediction of Daniel chapter 9, and if God gave the prediction of the time of the establishment of the kingdom, and carefully now, if God in that very prophecy predicted the rejection of his Son, then the rejection of his Son did not catch God off guard and did not and could not and would not prevent the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 9. And this guy has flip-flopped. I've never said Jesus failed. I've never said God failed. Well, you didn't use the terminology. He didn't. But if you say that God set the time, Jesus came at just the right time, and he came to do what the Father gave him to do, but he didn't do it then guess what? The challenge of Christ fails. Or Jesus failed his own challenge. And so this gentleman says, well, the establishment of the kingdom, some promises are conditional in the Bible. Well, that's true. Absolutely true. Jeremiah chapter 18 establishes that fact. But as I pointed out to this individual, he and all dispensationalists, okay, this is the burden, this is the challenge of the dispensationalist. You must be able to prove that the prophecy of Daniel chapter 9 was conditional. You must be able to prove that God ever said, ever indicated, ever hinted at the fact that the rejection of his son was going to postpone, to prevent, to do a reset of the kingdom plans. And here's the deal. Look, ladies and gentlemen, this goes back to the charts that I've been presenting to you. All right? Let me go back over and develop chart number 7. Chart number 7, which is a great deal of reiteration of what I've shared with you over the last several months. But it's so critically important to grasp what these charts are setting forth. Point number 1. If there is not a 2,000-year gap in the text of Daniel chapter 9, okay, then Jesus failed to establish the kingdom at the time appointed by Daniel. Now, again, dispensationalists say two things. Number one, Thomas I says, well, yeah, there is a gap in the text. Other dispensationalists say, well, there's not a gap in the text itself, but from other passages, we learn that Daniel was conditional. Well, number one, there is no text written after Daniel that suggests that Daniel was conditional. Secondly, the prophecy of Jeremiah chapter 18 that said there are some prophecies that are conditional does not apply to Daniel chapter 8 because the prophecy of, Daniel 9, because the prophecy of Daniel 9 concerns the establishment of the kingdom, the sitting of Christ on the throne of David, and God says emphatically those promises, those prophecies are not conditional. But let me continue. So if there's no gap, then God altered the timing of Daniel's prophecy. In other words, if there's not a gap in the text, and Jesus came at the right time determined by Daniel, but he could not do what the Father sent him to do, and thus God did a great prophetic calendar reset, that means that God altered his plan. Hang on to that. So if God, in Daniel chapter 9, determined the time for the establishment of the kingdom, the time came, but due to Jewish rebellion, Jesus could not do what the Father sent him to do, then God relented in his time purpose, because his purpose was to establish the kingdom in the first century. Now remember, ladies and gentlemen, Daniel chapter 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 12, all set the time for the establishment of the kingdom, for the judgment, for the vindication of the martyrs, all within the time frame of the Roman Empire. And no, not a revived, restored Roman Empire. There is no such doctrine in the Bible. Okay, so let me reiterate these 3 points extremely quickly. If there is no gap in Daniel 9, then Jesus failed to establish the kingdom at the time set by Daniel chapter 9, which was the first century. Point number 2, if there's no gap in the text of Daniel chapter 9, and God reset the time, and made it a different time from Daniel chapter 9, then he altered the word. Point number 3, if God set the time for the establishment of the kingdom, according to Daniel chapter 9, and all millennialists admit that he did, but he could not do it due to the Jewish rebellion and unbelief, then God relented of his time and stated time for the establishment of the kingdom. But consider once again with me, ladies and gentlemen, point number 1. Now, again, this is reiteration, but I don't know of anything that's more important for us to be able to see, to grasp, to understand, and to allow it to change our minds like it did mine. Psalms chapter 2. Why do the heathen rage? Why do the kings of the earth set themselves in array against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, come, let us set ourselves against them. He who sits in the heaven will laugh. He will hold them in derision. So here is the Father, not only knowing about the Jewish rejection and rebellion against his Son and against himself, not only knowing about it, but predicting it. And the text says he will laugh at their unbelief. He will hold them in derision for their rebellion. And it says, yet. You know, there are some words in the Bible that are just incredibly powerful. Yet, which means in spite of their rebellion, in spite of their unbelief, in spite of their rejection of my Son, yet have I set my King on my holy hill Zion. Now, very quickly, some people say, well, that's not true because Zion is literal Jerusalem. No. In prophecy, in messianic prophecy, Zion is in heaven. Just like the New Testament writer says in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 21, you have come to Mount Zion. Well, folks, he wasn't writing to people, thousands of people who were gathered around the literal city of Jerusalem, who were gathered around the literal Mount Zion. No, it's heavenly Zion, as he goes ahead to say right there in Hebrews chapter 12. You have come to the heavenly Jerusalem. That's Zion, heavenly Zion. So, pardon me. So, again, point number 1, God not only knew that Israel would reject his Son, he foretold it. And he said he was going to laugh at their rebellion. Now, someone might say, well, yeah, he will eventually laugh, but because he will eventually put his king on the throne. Ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't say that. If God allowed Israel in her rebellion and rejection and unbelief to change the original plans, then they were the ones laughing. They were the one whose derision was preventing God from doing what he originally intended to do. The only way that the language of Psalms chapter 2 works is if God sent his Son at the right time, knowing he would be rejected, but knowing also and predicting that in spite of that rebellion, he was going to laugh at them. He was going to hold them in derision, and he would fulfill his purpose. Because, you see, the rejection of his Son was always part of the plan. It was not an accident. It was not unforeseen. It was not unpredicted. As our next chart next week will show, It was the plan. Point number 2, Psalms 89, verse 34 and following. The Lord said concerning his promise to seat the Messiah on the throne of David, the Lord said, I will not relent, and I will not alter the word that has gone out of my mouth. Now, ladies and gentlemen, go back to the 3 points that I just shared with you. God set the time for the establishment of the kingdom, for the installation of the king, the Messiah, on the throne of David. He set the time for it. And God said, I will not alter my plan. Well, the plan was to do that in the first century. Not 2,000, 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 years later. The plan was to do it in the first century according to the time frame of Daniel chapter 9. Thus, when our dispensational friends tell us, oh, well, yeah, God's altered the plan and that will happen in our future. Sorry, God said I'm not altering my plan. Point number 3, and because I'm almost out of time. God said in Isaiah chapter 42, verse 5 and following, concerning the promise that he was going to send his son to establish the kingdom in the days of his incarnation, when a bruised reed shall he not break, a smoking flax shall he not quench. And it says, he will not fail. Now, as I've shared with you, ladies and gentlemen, anytime we say, yes, God sent his son at just the right time. Jesus came at just the right time. And God sent him to establish the kingdom. He came to establish the kingdom, just as Jesus said when Pilate said, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus said, for this reason was I born. For this reason did I come into this world. So yeah, Jesus came to be the king and to establish the kingdom. But he also said, my kingdom is not of this world, not an earthly kingdom. Jesus did not fail. Thank you so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. I'm out of time. I'll see you next week.